I'm here on the floor today to talk about legislation that helps our national parks, something that everyone on this floor has been supportive of over the years. And I'm here with a couple of colleagues who spent a lot of time and effort focused on that issue. One is Senator Angus King, who is an independent, although he organizes over there with the Democrats. He and his colleague, Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, have been very involved in this issue and have introduced legislation to address the unmet needs in our parks. It's a critical issue right now, $12 billion in a deferred maintenance backlog at our national parks. Many of our roads and bridges and water systems and railroads in my home state, where we have a railroad running through a national park, are crumbling. We need to address it. So we're going to hear a little from Senator King today about that. The other colleague I want to talk about is Senator Alexander. And he has been a champion for the parks over the years. In fact, my recollection is that a few decades ago, President Ronald Reagan named him to a commission on the outdoors, probably when he was governor of Tennessee, one of his many jobs he's had, including being Secretary of Education and also President of the University of Tennessee. But through all of his jobs and through his lifetime, he has been a huge supporter of the national parks and understands as well as anybody else, given that he's from Tennessee, where they have lots of unmet needs, the desperate need right now for us to figure out a way to address this maintenance backlog. I mentioned $12 billion. That's a big price tag. And it's more than the funding that we give the parks every year could possibly accommodate. And again, it's about long-term capital costs. I think it was Senator Alexander and others who have said it's almost like we have a debt unpaid. And that debt needs to be paid in order for us to continue to have our national parks be this shining example for our country and really the rest of the world. 330 million visitors last year at our national parks. Think about that. So visitation is up, and yet you have this crumbling infrastructure and huge issues that must be addressed. So we've come up with a creative way to deal with it. It takes the revenue from the offshore and onshore federal energy projects and says, okay, if it's on federal land, some of the royalties come to the federal government. Let's take not the money that's already going to the Land and Water Conservation Fund and other good purposes, but let's take half of the part that has no other allocation currently, and let's use it to address this issue. And by doing so, we think we can address half of the backlog, about $6 billion over the next 5 years. Now, it so happens that the National Park Service has been asked to look at all these projects and to come up with which ones are of immediate concern and where there's a true crisis where you've got to address it now, or the need's going to get much greater. And by the way, the taxpayer costs are going to increase dramatically because this is a compounding problem. When you don't fix the roof, then you end up having to repair and replace the entire building. So we believe that there's a way to do this, a sensible way for us to use some of this funding. And guess what? So does a lot of other people all around the country, because we've got support from all kinds of groups who are supporting the parks around the country, conservation groups, groups that care a lot about what the experience is of the visitor at the parks. We've also got support from our colleagues in the House. They have a companion bill that's bipartisan also. Republicans and Democrats alike are supporting it. It's gotten strong support in their committees over there, as this bill has gotten in our committee here. In fact, it got out of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee with a big bipartisan vote. And then finally, and in some respects maybe most importantly, as a former director of the Office of Management and Budget, the administration is supporting it, because sometimes the administration is careful about supporting proposals that have to do with this sort of spending, the mandatory spending, so-called, that comes from the revenue from these natural gas and oil resources that are on federal lands, offshore and onshore. So we have the Trump administration supporting it. We have so many colleagues on both sides of the aisle supporting it. We have so many outside groups supporting it. And why? It's just time to do it. It's a very sensible idea that will actually save taxpayer dollars over the long haul because, again, by fixing these crumbling projects and infrastructure, you won't have the huge additional costs that would be borne otherwise. And let's face it, these parks are our treasures and our legacy, and we need to protect them. With that, I'm going to ask my colleague from Tennessee to say a few words and my colleague from Maine to say a few words in whatever order they would like to go in. Let me just finally say this is a sad note. I learned on Monday that my colleague from Tennessee, who's about to speak, has decided that at age 78, it's time for him to enjoy a more peaceful and enjoyable lifestyle outside the United States Senate, and he's not running for re-election in 2 years. 2 years is a long time. We're going to get a lot done together. This bill is one of them. But I'm going to miss him a lot. He is the best legislator, I believe, in the United States Senate. He knows how to get things done. That's saying a lot. There are a lot of great legislators here. But he can bring together disparate parties, not just Democrats and Republicans, but sometimes within our parties, personalities and so on are not easy to deal with. He manages to smooth all the feathers, get things done, and this Parks bill is an example of that. He's been a leader on this issue, and I've had a great experience working with him already. And again, I hope that working together, this will be one of the many legacy items that he will get to talk to his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren about. With that, I would like to turn it over to Senator King from Maine and then Senator Alexander from Tennessee.
The senator from Maine speak. I thank the senator from Ohio for his generous comments, and I defer to the senator from Maine.
Well, first I'd like to thank the gentleman from Ohio for bringing forth this proposal, which makes so much sense, which, as he points out, has bipartisan support. In fact, I don't know if I've ever heard you make so much sense twice in the same time of being on the floor about this bill and about Senator Alexander. You were right on both counts. We're certainly going to miss the senator from Tennessee, but like the characters in Tom Sawyer, when Tom and Huck were in the attic of the church at their own funeral, he's still here, and he's going to be here for another 2 years. We're going to get a lot done. I had a very formative experience as governor of Maine. Every year we used to go to New York to talk to the rating agencies about our bond issues and our bond rating. Of course, the desire of any governor of any state is to have a good bond rating so that you pay less interest. And at one point, I was making a presentation to the bond issue, to the bond council, the rating agencies in New York, and I said, we have low debt and we don't take on much bonds and we pay them off in 10 years and we're really keeping the bond indebtedness down. And one of these green eye shade guys stopped me. He said, Governor, when you're not fixing things, it's debt, just as if it's on your balance sheet. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a debt that's going to have to be fixed sooner or later, and we've come up with a method of funding it that's very creative, that doesn't take funds from another purpose, it's symmetrical because it takes funds from the utilization of federal lands to provide the maintenance and support for other federal lands for the national park system. And the senator from Ohio mentioned 330 million people visited our national parks last year. That happens to be the entire population of the United States. We have a wonderful park in Maine, Acadia. We had 3.5 million people last year at that park. But the problem is, I've seen leaky roofs and roads that need repair, and if we don't do that, we're not serving the public, we're not serving the next generation of Americans who want to enjoy the parks, and now we have an opportunity to do so that is supported on a bipartisan basis in this body, in the other body, and by the administration. So this is something that we ought to be able to do, and it is a responsibility that we have. I would say maintaining what we have is one of our most fundamental responsibilities. And this is a bill that enables us to do that in a way that is responsible fiscally. And I want to emphasize that if we don't do this, we're adding to the national debt. And we're adding to the national debt that's going to have to be paid. Construction costs always go up, so in effect, it's going to have to be paid with interest. And now is the time to take this step in order to maintain the national parks in the condition that our American public deserves, and they expect us to meet this responsibility. So I want to compliment and thank the senator from Ohio, from Tennessee, our colleague Mark Warner from Virginia, for bringing this bill forward. We've now added co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, and we're ready to make this happen. And there's no reason that we can't move forward, hopefully, in this Congress, if not very early in the next Congress. But this is one of those things where it's not all that glamorous, repairing roofs and doing trail maintenance in national parks, but it'll mean something to the people who come. And someday, years from now, a family will walk through Acadia National Park or Yosemite or the Great Smokies or the great parks in Ohio, and they won't know who fixed that trail. They won't know who repaired that visitor center. They'll just know that they've had one of the most memorable experiences of their life, and somebody helped that to take place. And I just hope, Mr. President, that that somebody is us, because we are able to do it. We have the means, we have the vehicle, and now is the time to move this bill, to do something, to pay a debt that we all have to the American people. Mr. President, I yield to my esteemed colleague from Tennessee.
I thank the senator from Maine and the senator from Ohio. You know, I often say to my constituents in Tennessee that they might look at Washington, D.C. as if it were a split-screen television, because on one side you have, for example, in September, all the mudslinging and back and forth of the Judge Kavanaugh hearing. But on the other side of the screen, at the very same time, the very same Senate, very same Capitol, you had 72 senators working together on opioids legislation. Senator Portman had a major role in that. You had a songwriter's bill that Senator Hatch and I had been working on, took 15 years to do. You had appropriations bills with the 4th year of biomedical funding, and you had coming out of the Interior and Energy committees in our Senate, by a vote of 19-4 in the Senate and unanimously in the House, a piece of legislation sponsored by Senator Portman, Senator Warren, Senator King, and myself and others that will do more for our national park system than has been done in 50 years. I don't know how often my colleagues hear someone say, well, why don't you guys ever do anything? Why don't you stop arguing with each other? Just on the floor a moment ago, I heard the senator from New Jersey talk about a prison sentencing bill that the senator from Utah was talking about at lunch in the Republican caucus, and that President Trump was talking to me about on Sunday night. They're all for it. It's a huge change in prison sentencing. I mentioned a number of bills. So on the side of the split-screen television that is the problem-solving part of the United States Senate is the Restore Our Parks Act, the Portman, Warner, King, Alexander bill that will do more for the national park system, the 418 units of it, than anything in a half century. And it not only has our support, it has in the House of Representatives 228 bipartisan supporters. It has in the United States Senate 37 of our 100 members already. I expect it will have more. And it's strongly supported by President Trump. It has 100 conservation groups for it. Now let's think about that for a minute. What else can you think of that has President Trump, 100 conservation groups, 228 House members, and 37 senators in favor of it that is such a good idea? I can think of nothing else. For example, in the Smoky Mountains, and Senator Portman and his family have been there to our home more than once. He's a great outdoorsman. He's a great leader for the national parks in many areas. But there's a Look Rock campground that's been closed for several years. We would have 5,000 families visit it if it were open. And the problem with it is the roof leaks and the bathrooms don't work, and so it's closed. Well, we're going to fix it, but that is true all over the country. So I guess the logical question is, then why don't we go ahead and pass it? Well, the problem is the way we pay for it. Senator Portman is a former budget director, and Senator King discussed the funding of the issue. It's because we pay for it with something we call mandatory funding. But it's not the kind of mandatory funding that we usually worry about in the Senate. That's when we borrow money and use it to pay for Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and other entitlements, and that's running our debt way up. All of us are worried about that. This is different in 3 ways. The senator from Maine talked about it. This is really debt that we're reducing. Deferred maintenance is debt, and this is the backlog that we intend to fix. The second is we're using real money. We're not borrowing money to spend. We're taking money from drilling for oil or for gas or for other energy on revenue and paying for other needs, and then we're using some of that money, up to $6.5 billion, I believe, to pay for about half of the deferred maintenance needs of the national park system. That's not a budget gimmick. That's real money to reduce debt. And then it's in one other way not the same as the mandatory funding we often talk about here. It's authorized only for 5 years. It's a limited, targeted program using real money to reduce debt, supported by Republicans and Democrats, the Senate and the House, the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration, and the president himself. So I agree with the senator from Maine, and I congratulate the senator from Ohio. He and Senator Warner of Virginia were the two senators who came up with this idea working with conservation groups. Senator King and I had a similar idea. We put the bills together. And we thought the right person to be the principal sponsor is the former budget director, Senator Portman, because we're talking about spending money, and Senator Warner, who has been such a leader in the area, and Senator King. So I agree. We ought to pass it this week with that kind of support. It's a terrific idea that almost all Americans would support. But we're here on the floor to say that if it doesn't pass this week, it ought to be the first order of business in the first month we get back. And I look forward to working with the senator from Ohio and the senator from Maine to help accomplish that.
I appreciate the comments of my colleagues, both from Maine and from Tennessee, and they're both absolutely right. This legislation is ready to be passed. We've done the hard work, we've done the research, we've looked at a number of creative ways to handle this backlog that everybody wants to get at. Everybody agrees that our national parks are such crown jewels of our country and we need to address it. Everybody knows that if you don't fix the roof and the building ends up falling down, you have to pay a lot more. So to the point that this is a debt unpaid, it's also a debt that grows because it compounds over time. And these are two former governors who just spoke, and they did this in their own states, what you might call capital budgeting. In other words, looking not just at your annual expenses for, in this case, park rangers and naturalists, but to actually look at how do you take a building that is about to fall down and put the enormous amount of expense into that to ensure that you save money over time. I will say I've been all around my state. We don't have parks that are quite as big as Acadia or the Smokies, but we do have a lot of beautiful parks in Ohio. One is the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is actually number 13 in the country now in visitation, between Akron and Cleveland, Ohio. And it is a fantastic opportunity for young people who come every year, school kids, and by the way, there's lots of volunteer work going on at all of these parks, including Cuyahoga Valley. So we're not talking about displacing the volunteer work that's being done. That's very effective at building the trails, at ensuring that where young people particularly can be involved in helping our parks, they have an opportunity to do so. There's also a lot of friends groups out there. The Friends Group in Cuyahoga Valley National Park happens to be headed by the national president now of the Association of Friends Group. All these parks have great groups of private citizens who give their money, private foundations who give their money for our national parks, and that's all needed, but they cannot afford the $12 billion maintenance backlog that is the responsibility of the federal government. And so $47 million, as an example, is needed at Cuyahoga Valley National Park to fix that railroad I talked about, to fix a bridge that I saw about to fall down, to fix the roof at a visitor center that's about to fall down. It's also $47 million roughly for a monument off Lake Erie, the Perry Monument. And some of you know the story of Admiral Perry. Well, there's a seawall there to protect the Perry Monument and the interpretive center there. That seawall is crumbling, and it's a huge expense to repair a seawall, as a coastal governor like Governor King will tell you. And so that's a maintenance backlog issue that has to be addressed in this kind of a capital bill. So I am very excited about the opportunity to get this done. I think Senator Alexander is right. It's going to be difficult to get it done this week because we're up against the end of the year and we have so many other priorities. On the other hand, this one has not just bipartisan support, but I would say nonpartisan support and bicameral support. And it's one of those that I think Senator Alexander is exactly right. We ought to put at the top of the agenda. It'll be a great win. I think the American people are looking for wins right now. I think people are wondering how can divided government work? Well, here's an example of how it could work. You have the administration, Democrats and Republicans alike, saying this is a problem, long in the making, by the way. It didn't just happen recently. It's been years and years of us delaying the expenditures for these capital improvements that are needed. And wouldn't it be great? So we're going to hit the ground running. Come January, we'll reintroduce our legislation. Senator Alexander and Senator King and Senator Warner and I are going to be out there getting co-sponsors for any staff that happen to be listening. We want to talk to you and your member, because you ought to be on this bill if you're not one of the more than 1/3 of the Senate that's already a part of it. And I just can't thank my colleagues enough for showing up today to talk a little about this. I know Senator Warner is busy with other meetings right now, but speaking for him, I will just say he came up with this, I think, very creative idea. I want to thank him for his hard work on this. I know that in his home state, with the Blue Ridge and other great national parks, he's got the same sense of urgency that all of us have, which is if we don't address this and don't address this now, we're going to see the visitor experience be diminished. We're going to see a lot of higher costs for taxpayers. This is the time. We have the organizations behind us. Senator Alexander talked about 100 conservation organizations. I didn't know there were 100 conservation organizations, but they're all on board, and they understand that this is the opportunity to do something very significant. I think Senator Alexander's right. Probably in the 100-year history of our national parks, there's never been a single bill that can make such a big difference. Maybe not since Teddy Roosevelt decided to start acquiring land to protect our American treasures. So we need to get this done, and I thank my colleagues, and I welcome them to make any final comments. Senator King?
My only final comment is to suggest a friendly amendment as to how to allocate these funds. I suggest alphabetically, and the fact that Acadia is in Maine is a mere coincidence. But seriously, I think my two colleagues have made a very powerful case. Hopefully we're going to be able to move this again through the committee. As Senator Alexander reported, it has already been considered and reported favorably by the committee, and hopefully it'll be one of the first items of business in the new year. As you say, Senator Portman, this is a win. It's a win for the American people, and I think it will be reassuring that we can, in fact, find ways to work together on important national problems. And Senator Alexander listed the things done. The only one he didn't mention was the Farm Bill, which passed last week, I think 87-13. Heavily negotiated, entirely bipartisan, makes a real difference for rural America. Here's a chance to make a difference for all of those who love and treasure our national parks, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to make it happen.
Thank you. Mr. President, I thank my colleagues, and I'll conclude the colloquy if that's all right with Senator Warner, Senator Portman. And then I ask consent for 10 minutes to speak about Senator Hatch.
Without objection.
But prior to doing that, I want to join Senator Portman in acknowledging the leadership of Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, along with the conservation community, in developing the bones of this bill. We had competing bills. He and Senator Portman were out there first, so we did what we should do. We put them together, and look what the result. So that happens a lot more than people notice. When an airplane lands safely, it's not news. When it crashes, it is. This is an example of one landing safely, and my prediction is that if all of those 100 conservation groups and all of those senators and congressmen who already support this will sign up with us quickly in January, we can get this train moving, and we can begin to fix the roofs and repair the bathrooms and build the roads and take America's best idea, our national parks, and make it what the American people expect it to be. So I thank Senator Portman and Senator King for their leadership, as well as Senator Warner.